Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hadn't had this in the opening, but I want to disagree with my friend right off the top. The President of the United States does not work for the Congress of the United States. He works for the American people, and he heads up a branch of government that is a co-equal branch of government. So on that, we'll have a long discussion. But it's been a very eventful week, Mr. Speaker, in the Rules Committee, and it's only Tuesday. Last night, the committee met and reported out a rule that covers two drastically different measures. H.R. 2740 is an appropriations package which covered first 5 and then 4 of the 12 appropriations bills for fiscal year 2020. We also considered H.R. 430, a resolution that gives authority to the Office of the General Counsel to seek to enforce certain subpoenas for documents through litigation. Shortly after we finish here, the committee will again convene to consider the remainder of the appropriations package, which will be on the floor as part of a separate rule tomorrow. Meanwhile, our members will attempt the miracle of being in two places at once as we continue to debate HRS 430, which falls into our original jurisdiction here on the floor. House Resolution 430, Mr. Speaker, comes from a dispute over documents relating to the special counsel's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. The dispute also stems from the inherent oversight authority Congress and our ability to perform oversight functions over the executive branch. And it falls into the fuzzy boundaries between the branches of government, when and how we may compel the executive branch to turn over documents to the legislative branch. I lay out that framework because there's an important point here that's being lost. The Democratic majority clearly wants to make this dispute entirely about this president, this Attorney General, this White House counsel, this investigation, this subpoena of documents. The Democrats want to focus attention there because they think it helps them politically to do so. But this dispute really shouldn't be about just that. It should rather be about the difficult and thorny questions that emerge in a system like ours with 3 branches of government with checks and balances. In a sense, what the majority is seeking to do here today is completely unprecedented, both in its intent and in its execution. Consider the only other times the House has filed a lawsuit to seek to enforce a subpoena for documents. It's happened twice before, Mr. Speaker, once in 2007 to seek documents from the former White House counsel Harriet Miers, and again in 2012 to seek documents from then Attorney General Eric Holder as a result of the congressional investigation into the Fast and Furious scandal. In both of these cases, the House had already voted to hold both Miers and Holder in contempt of Congress before filing suit, which has not yet happened in this case. In the Miers case, 138 days elapsed from the first document request to the Judiciary Committee voting to hold her in contempt. In the Holder case, it was significantly longer. 464 days elapsed from the first document request to the committee voting to hold him in contempt. That was well over a year. But here, the majority is forcing us to rush forward at a much faster pace. Just 44 days elapsed from the date of the first document request to the Attorney General until the Judiciary Committee voted to hold him in contempt. 44 days. James Holzhauer has been champion of jeopardy for longer than that. I don't understand the majority's haste here. Without exhausting all other options, continuing negotiation, discussion, compromise, and turning to a vote on contempt as the last resort, the majority is instead pushing us forward into litigation with the executive branch. And in doing so, they may well be placing the House in a position that causes significant long-term damage to the institution. When this matter goes before the courts, it will do so as a case of first impression and under an untested legal theory. In both the Miers and Holder cases, the House previously voted to hold those 2 individuals in contempt of Congress. Nothing like that's been done here, and using untested tactics like this could set a dangerous precedent that harms us all, Republicans and Democrats, in the long run. Finally, I would also note that it's not clear what this resolution will ultimately accomplish. Since the House has not yet exercised all the tools in its toolkit, and since it's not clear that the negotiations with the Justice Department and the White House over the documents at issue is at an end, this whole thing may be nothing more than sound and fury. Indeed, given how quickly the majority is rushing into things, it seems unlikely that the only course of action left to the House is to file a lawsuit. I strongly urge the majority to continue working with the Justice Department and the White House to find a resolution to these issues without resorting to knee-jerk lawsuit that may ultimately damage the House as an institution. Today, we're also beginning consideration of H.R. 2740, an appropriations package covering 5 of 12 appropriations bills: Labor, Health and Human Services and Education, the Legislative Branch, Defense, State and Foreign Ops, and Energy and Water. These 5 bills cover over 70% of our total discretionary spending for the fiscal year 2020. Well, to be precise, Mr. Speaker, we were to do 5 bills. At the last moment, the majority pulled the legislative branch appropriations bill. I'll let them explain why at their leisure. As a longtime member of the Appropriations Committee, I'm pleased that we're beginning to move the appropriations bills to the floor. Unfortunately, the bills here before us have some numerous flaws, most notably that they are marked to allocation levels that aren't realistic. As we move forward through the appropriations process, I think we need to be clear about the challenges we face this year. At the end of September, the FY 2019 year expires, and sequestration cuts contained in the Budget Control Act 2011 will automatically take effect for FY 2020. In order to prevent that, we need to come to a bipartisan, bicameral budget deal that the House, the Senate, and the President can all agree on. If we don't, then it doesn't really matter what fake number the House marks to. Sequestration will hit, and our defense budget will automatically be slashed by 11%, and our non-defense budget by 9% below the allocations of 2019. The spending levels in these appropriations bills are not just ambitious, they are unrealistic. Not only are the funding levels for many of these bills too high, so high that the Senate and the President will never agree to them, but the allocations the Appropriations Committee used to reflect the misguided notion that any increase in defense spending must be matched by an increase in non-defense spending that is more than twice as high. That's simply not a realistic assessment of our national priorities or the physical limitations imposed on us by our rising national debt. The defense provision of this bill, for example, comes in at $8 billion less than the President told us was needed to adequately fund the military, maintain readiness, and be prepared to confront international threats. After years of severe underfunding of our armed forces, and at a time when threats are emerging everywhere from around the globe, spending less than the administration asked for on defense in order to push more money into domestic programs is not a wise course of action. I'm disappointed that the majority chose to strip out pro-life provisions that have been carried in appropriations bills for years. Instead, they added controversial pro-abortion riders that virtually guarantee no Republican support whatever for this package. As the former chair and current ranking member of the Labor, Health and Human Services Subcommittee, I'm familiar with the need for compromise on that particular piece of legislation. But by pushing forward with blatantly partisan riders like these, the majority is guaranteeing the outcome of these bills, dead on arrival in a Republican-led Senate and no chance of getting a Republican president's signature. In the coming months, I hope we will work through these problems, frankly, as we did last year. The majority intends to move forward with unrealistic spending levels and insists on maintaining partisan riders, then we're simply guaranteeing a failed appropriations process. And make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, our failure has consequences. A best-case scenario in a year-long continuing resolution that funds the government at the exact same level as the current year. That's the best scenario if we fail. Worst-case scenario is another government shutdown or sequestration that cuts sequestration cuts that automatically cut all government funding levels. Neither of these is a good outcome for the House as an institution, for the federal government, or more importantly, for the American people. Mr. Speaker, although I cannot support either bill before us today, I am hopeful that we will eventually reach a bipartisan, bicameral compromise on spending that the vast majority of members in this House can support. That requires realistic funding levels and elimination of partisan riders from this package. The spending package before us today may be a worthy starting point, but it will take hard work and compromise to move the final bill that can become law. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge opposition to the rule, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman.